Jesus' ministry focused around three primary things. He focused around his preaching, his teaching, and his miracles. And you could pretty well sum up Jesus' ministry in that way. And then I mentioned also earlier that he had different levels of ministry. I mentioned three, there's actually four, I think. He had the corporate ministry where he ministered to large gatherings, and that was usually through miracles and preaching. Then he had congregational ministry. That was where, as they traveled around, they would have larger groups of 120 people, for example. That's a common term, understanding we have from the Bible. And he used it in those areas. He ministered primarily through his teaching and his miracles. But then out of that, he chose 12 guys. And they were all uneducated, except, as far as we can tell, maybe Matthew and Luke. Most of the other guys were what we would call blue-collar people. Fishermen, carpenters, and so forth and so on. Even had a political radical in his group. But he had those 12, and he poured his life into those 12. For the last 2 years, I've been teaching a home Bible study in our home on the Gospel of John. Finally, this last year, we got through chapter 12. So next year, we'll pick up with the things leading up to the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. But the thing that struck me is how Jesus spent so much of his time, particularly in his teaching and discipling time with small group. And wherever he went, those 12 went with him. And he taught them. In fact, even some of the preaching, or some of the teaching that Jesus did on the Sermon on the Mount, it says very clearly, he said to his disciples, not to the big crowd. The big crowd just overheard what he was saying. But the point is that Jesus did everything that he possibly could with those 12. There are 7 major commands in the gospel that Jesus made. Let me just, if I can remember them. The first one wasn't a command, it was a response to a question. When Jesus and John the Baptist met together, John the Baptist's 2 disciples, brothers, James and John, asked about Jesus. And John told them, go find out. And as they're walking along, they finally come to him. He acknowledges their presence and basically says, you guys need something. And I kind of laugh about this. I think he was sort of amused, and they said, well, where do you live? Where are you going? And Jesus' first declaration to them was, come and see. That was the first statement he made to those disciples, come and see. All right. Then, after that, the next statement he made was, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. Then it goes on in the book of Mark, and it says, then he called his disciples to be with him. To be with him. Wherever he went, he wanted his disciples to be with him. It didn't matter whether it was in Jerusalem or on the seashore overlooking the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum. They'd be with him. And then he tells them to learn of me. And then he tells them to go. And it goes on like this. And the seventh thing, the very last thing that he ever told them to do before he went to heaven was go make disciples. Make disciples who make disciples who make disciples who do the same thing. And so this was the level of his ministry. So here's my question. And I have these questions that I listed here under Roman numeral 3. How many of his disciples came out of large gatherings? None. Now they may have been there. They may have been listening. But who did Jesus mentor and disciple? In other words, what was his primary ministry that made it possible for the Great Commission to cover the world and for the gospel to have been spread to the entire known world by the end of the first century? It didn't come from his large preaching. It's like I said this morning. It can't be mathematically, it can't be done. He did it by focusing on these 12 guys, and out of those 12 guys, he had 3, Peter, James, and John, that were the core group. And they basically made things happen. And they're the ones. And you go back and look at the role that Peter, James, and John had, even in the writing of the epistles. Apart from Paul, every other epistle in there, and then Jude and the writer of Hebrews, nobody knows for sure. A lot of people think Paul did. A lot of people think Apollos did. But you look at the New Testament books, and the most of them come from either Paul, who is that apostle born out of season, or one of these three guys. See? So you have to recognize there is an importance to this idea of strong personal one-on-one relational mentoring of these young men that came to change the world. To me, it's stunning. And then how many of the disciples, beside the 12, can you name? We could maybe name another dozen different people like Mary and Martha and Lazarus and so on like that. But most of us could not name those. And then I mentioned the question, how many New Testament books were not written by the 12? Paul's letters and Hebrews probably is about it. And then, how did Jesus choose the few? We talked about that. And how many of these apostles, disciplers, and this is where my interest is right now. I want to go back and study. I know a little bit. I know where some of the disciples, the original 12, went. And I know who a few of their mentor or their disciplers were. And I know that Timothy and Titus obviously were two of those for Paul. But then you have other people that was it Epaphras and some others that came from people like John and some of the others that became key leaders. But the point is, the gospel spread because of the discipling process. And this is why it's so important. Whatever else you do, there should always be someone in your life that you're pouring your life into to replace you when you're gone. And not only to replace you, but to replicate while you're still here what you've been doing. And that's so important. So he sent, at one point, he sent the 12, then he sent the 70, and then his final Great Commission. Now, this raises a question. If all of this is true, and I think it is, then why do pastors resist the temptation of discipleship groups? Many do. Now you may be a person that is totally committed to this, but I have to tell you that in America, I venture to say 95 to 98% of the pastors in America do not do any personal discipling. And then they wonder why there's a shortage of pastors. So think about this. One of the smartest things you'll ever do is to get 2 or 3 or 4 guys that you can pour your life into. And they can either replace you or you can send them somewhere to do something new. You see. Well, I listed, I think, about 14 different things that came to my mind. And the reason that I listed these is because most of those were reasons that I didn't disciple others until I was older in my life. One is I don't feel I'm worthy. Well, if you feel you're worthy, you're not. And those who feel we're unworthy, we're right. None of us are worthy. There is you don't have enough worthiness to merit the privilege. You know, Paul described himself as the worst sinner of all. And he described in Romans chapter 7, he described his own personal struggles. He said, I don't understand myself. Verse 15. He said, the things that I ought to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do them anyway. But at the same time, think of this. In more than 20 years, the kind of ministry that Paul had in advancing the gospel. So it had nothing to do with unworthiness. Then a lot of times we feel incapable or unqualified. I just don't have the credentials to do it. I don't have the knowledge. Well, you can get that. And one of the best ways I know to get that is to get into the Word and spend time in God's presence with His Word and in prayer. And He'll show you. He'll show you what you need to know and what you need to do. Another one is the false assumption that discipleship comes automatically. It doesn't come automatically. If Jesus had expected people to follow him automatically, he wouldn't have had anybody following. Because they'd have all flaked off pretty soon after a few months of sensationalism and miracles and stuff. Because what does it say in John 6:66? Many of them, after these sayings, many of them followed him no more because his sayings were hard. His sayings were hard. Also, laziness. People just don't want to pay the price. They just want a comfortable Christian life that doesn't cost them anything. Some people are too busy. I had a pastor call me one time, or talk to me one time. We were talking about getting a group of pastors to come get together once a month to pray. He said, Bob, I'd really love to do that, but I'm just too busy. And I thought, if you're too busy to pray, you're really, really too busy. You know. But there are people who just say, I just can't do it. Then there are those that they just want the praise and the pride of man. And you see, you can get the praise and accolades from a public ministry, but you don't get any praise and accolades and recognition from personal discipleship. It's just you and that little cluster of guys you're working with. And most of the people in your church will never know about it, but you'll know. And that's where your ministry should be invested. Don't abandon the preaching. I am totally convinced that the preaching of the cross is absolutely an imperative. But your disciples and your disciplers do not come from the preaching. It comes from the one-on-one, small, hands-on, intimate relationship where you're vulnerable with each other, you're open and honest, and they are willing to you're willing to pour your life into them, and they're willing to pass it on. We're going to look at that a little more closely in the last session today. And then, of course, the issue of pride. And another big thing that a lot of pastors don't disciple others is because they lose control. They feel like they cannot control. With the first church I ever served on staff after I left seminary, after my graduate studies, my pastor, I had a lady in the church that came and asked if I thought it was okay for me to start a home Bible study group with some of the women in her neighborhood. And I thought it was a fantastic idea, but I went to him and he said, no, he said, I don't want her doing that. He said, there's no way that I can monitor it and control it. And I thought, well, why? Well, I understand he doesn't want false teaching. But he knew this woman, and she was as spot on the Bible as anybody I'd ever known, really understood the Word of God. But he was afraid that he could not manage and control that Bible study group. So we didn't get to do it. And of course, one of the things that happens is that when we disciple others, we become vulnerable. And our disciples are going to discover our own frailties and weaknesses. They're going to discover that we have inconsistencies in our lives, and sometimes we're just too ashamed and embarrassed or too proud to do anything about that. So as a result, we just stay away from discipleship. Then we have the fear of failing. We might fail in discipling them, but there's another aspect too, and that is the reflection it has on us if our disciples fail. And I've had disciples fail. And people would look at that, they'd blame me and say, well, Bob, if you'd done a better job, he wouldn't have been that way. So there's always that as well. And then, of course, to attach to the world's values, secret sin, and then a misunderstanding of what the Great Commission really is. Because, folks, the Great Commission is make disciplers who make disciplers. That's the Great Commission.